sentiment of my partner first and foremost, which is thank you very much. Red Sea has been a great experience for me. I'm very glad to be in front of you. That's my first competitive debating tournament for 6 years. So it's been a lovely return. In terms of a bit of a rebuttal before I get to my main speech today. No clash, really. Bit of a problem. Like, my partner gave you loads and loads of analysis about how practically impossible, right? And we've heard no response to any of that. So I want to flag that front and centre, that we've not really had much engagement from first opposition. In terms of the substantive stuff being brought about the Tibetan people not being able to practice their religions they want to, I'm going to do a lot of substantive work on that. So I want to integrate a lot of that. In terms of some of the things you were saying towards the end of this speech about global support and so on, I think it's really important to sort of emphasise that whilst we recognise, and countries around the world recognise the struggle of the Tibetan people to, have their situation recognised, that does not equate to material support in the way that he seems to imply. I think that couldn't be further from the truth. And we simply live in a reality now where China will be the economic powerhouse of the world in weeks and months to come, if not for centuries to come. And that means that it simply isn't on the negotiating table. We simply, like, as Britain as an example, we couldn't defend Hong Kong. We are not going to defend Tibet in terms of like their sort of ambitions towards their own sort of territorial certainty. Now, in terms of sort of substantive, I want to talk about how oppression, and this is sort of directly clashing in terms of what we've heard and what we will hear undoubtedly for almost certainly the entire rest of the debate. I want to talk about how oppression is inextricably linked to the issue of challenging the one China policy, because that's the key sort of crux of the debate today. Secondly, I want to talk about cultural space within the acceptance. Once you accept one China as an entity, there is an enormous amount of cultural space in China. And thirdly, I want to talk about how the 21st century is China's century, and how being a part of China is a massive positive for the people of Tibet. So oppression is inextricably linked to being part of the one China policy, and I'm sorry to do a bit of sort of history, but China had an enormously complicated road to its own formation. So the civil war that my partner mentioned, which saw the wrenching of the Kuomintang into Taiwan and the takeover of the People's Republic of China, saw a decades-long dispute where China was given a permanent seat on the Security Council in 1949, but the People's Republic of China was unable to take that seat until 1971. What happened was the Communist Party, and it was all caught up in the politics of the Cold War, the politics of the generations, which meant that there was this enormous dispute which coloured everything in international relations as to whether or not you accepted who was China. Who was China was the question of the mid-20th century. And you saw countries like India volunteering to not take a seat on the UN Security Council because they recognised that the People's Republic of China had a greater claim to it than they did. That was the type of significance that was being attributed to these kinds of issues about one China policy. One China policy is the defining feature of Chinese international relations. They took an incredibly pacifistic line. China has used its veto on the Security Council less than any other country. China has abstained from more votes in the United Nations than any other country. And why is that? Because they felt that they can't take part on the world stage until the world stage recognises the problems of China. And China sees as its central identity one China policy. That is why you see such a harsh line against Taiwan, despite the fact that Taiwan is a clear example of a group which has some historical grievances. It's why you see such a clear problem against Tibet, because all of the analysis you were given by the opposition team so far about why is religion oppressed, it is because it is inextricably linked with separatism. Okay? Separatism is the defining thing that the Chinese government will not accept. And what we say is giving up the demand of separatism equates to a Chinese government loosening all of the restrictions over cultural and religious freedom that we seek to protect in this debate today. Separatism is not worth the fight. Separatism is not important. What is important is cultural and religious space. And we say, in my second substantive point, well, that's what it's about today. But yes, sir.
Right, but it's functionally impossible to do that. Right, so in the same way as in the minds of many Westerners, Islam is inextricably tied up with terrorism, even though it's a tiny percentage.
Okay, well, I don't agree with you at all, sir. I think we have to make lots of obvious parallels here in terms of other armed struggles where we see emancipation from practical purposes. And I would point to Northern Ireland. You look at Catholic terrorism in Northern Ireland in favour of religious freedom and space, right? And what we see is that ultimately that was a strategy doomed to failure. It's one where ultimately separatism wasn't the answer. Uniting Ireland was not in the best interest of the Catholics in Northern Ireland. And what we see is that assimilation of Northern Ireland into the United Kingdom is one that has allowed religious space for everybody within that territory. We look at, if you want to take an even further historical example, we can look at Scotland as a Presbyterian nation, right? You can say that Scotland has unique cultural space within Great Britain, within the United Kingdom. They are not longer. They assimilated very, very gradually. Scotland was conquered 700 years ago by the English crown and has never been wiped out in terms of its cultural mix. That is a Scot you see sitting over there. He would never describe himself as an Englishman. He has cultural space because there was no armed struggle for independence for centuries in his name. So there are ways, and China is a great example of this already. You have Confucianism, you have Buddhism, you have pockets of Christianity within China, which are all allowed to practice and exist. Why? Because they don't demand territorial religious space. They do not contravene one China policy. That is the defining characteristic that the Chinese government will not allow to stand. They will not allow territorial separation to be the thing that defines your group. So thirdly, and probably too briefly, I want to talk about how the 21st century is China's century. Because we have to say, we've seen 10% year-on-year GDP growth in China. They are 1.3 billion people. They are the most significant economic force in the world. And they are, Winston Churchill had this expression where if you were born in 1890, you would want to be British. If you were born in 1949, you would want to be an American. If you were born in 2016, you would want to be Chinese. This is the century in which China is going to dominate the world stage. We've seen great change in China. We've seen a willingness to sign up to the Paris Accords this week. We've seen increasing engagement with the international community. And let me remind you of what I was talking about earlier. This stems from great rejection by the international community. Really not so many decades ago. We're all very young in this room, some of us more than others. But 1970 is not such a long time ago in the global order, and what we see is an increasingly open China, a China which is engaging, which is undergoing great economic development, is protecting its own people, and seeing and leading itself to the head of the global stage. And that is something we welcome, something the people of Tibet will welcome and benefit from tremendously, if they give up on a territorial ambition which serves nobody. Thank you.